Okay, you are listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHWWPPM. Tonight on the program, we will be joined by Ben Waxman, candidate for state representative in the 182nd House District. Our own Lance Haver will discuss the Septa budget, and we'll provide an update on an interesting couple of days in city budget hearings. And we will also discuss Pew's State of the City report. Lance, how are you tonight?
I'm all right. I had to turn my gas heat back on, so I'm a little disappointed. I'm sure I'll be surprised when I get my bill. I was looking forward to it falling.
Yeah, we've had some weird weather as of late. Denise Clay Murray will be joining us in the second half of the program. She's a little under the weather, but she's going to fight it out for us tonight when we talk about the Pew report. So the first thing we'd like to do is play for you our interview with Ben Waxman, candidate for state representative in the 182nd House District. Okay, Mr. Waxman, thank you for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about the 182nd District?
Sure. The 182nd District is Center City, Philadelphia, as well as a couple of adjacent neighborhoods to Center City in South Philadelphia. It is probably the most liberal district in the entire state of Pennsylvania. It's one of the most high turnout Democratic-leaning districts in the entire state. And it's certainly a district that has been impacted tremendously by the pandemic, and in particular, the lack of people coming into the downtown neighborhoods, for tourism, for shopping, for food, entertainment. All of that is impacting the people that live in Center City as well.
So, if elected, what would be your primary focuses in Harrisburg?
I think for me personally, and I think for a lot of my neighbors, the priority has got to be the recovery from the pandemic. And what I mean by that is obviously there was a tremendous economic impact, both here in Philadelphia, but really across the Commonwealth, because of the shutdowns, because of the restrictions, because of what we had to do to control the pandemic. Well, now is the time for us to make really, really big public investments, not just to restart our economy, but also to try to address many of the systematic inequalities in our society that were made worse by the pandemic. So for me, that's really, I talk about the 3 Ps: public safety, public infrastructure, and public schools. Those, for me, are the top priorities. We have a really, really serious, crisis in terms of public education funding in this Commonwealth. We are here in Philadelphia in particular. We are seeing major issues with our public transit system, both cleanliness, reliability, safety. These are the things that I hear a lot of people talking about. And so there just is a tremendous need for investment in our communities. And that's the priority for me going into the legislative session.
So there are other Democrats in this primary. What makes you stand out?
Well, look, the first thing I'll say is I have a lot of respect for the other people who are running. This is an open seat, so we're not really running against each other. We're more running, on our own backgrounds and our own qualifications. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on why I'm better than other people. I mean, I know a lot of state reps, and we could do a lot worse than the folks who are running in my primary, to be perfectly honest. For me personally, I think the thing that makes me attractive to voters is, this is a very, very progressive district. We all share the same values. I think the question becomes, who is it that can actually go to Harrisburg and implement those values and get things done? As far as I know, I think I'm the only candidate in the race who's worked in government in any capacity. I worked as a staffer for the Pennsylvania Senate Democratic Caucus and a state senator named Vincent Hughes. Who at that time was the highest ranking lawmaker from Philadelphia in the state legislature when I worked for him. I also held a pretty high profile role with the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. And I think it's just, people are saying, okay, so a lot of people agree about the issues. Who's the candidate that is ready on day one, who can walk into the building with an existing set of relationships and understanding about how how the legislature works. And I think that my background working in government makes me a really, really strong candidate to implement those values in Harrisburg.
So that brings me to my next point. One of the most important relationships the city of Philadelphia has is its relationship with Harrisburg. How would you make this relationship better for the benefit of the city and particularly the schools?
Well, I think the number one thing is we have to change the dynamic in Harrisburg where Republicans control the legislature. I mean, if you want to say what is going to be the difference maker, what is going to be the thing that is going to bring resources from Harrisburg back to Philadelphia in the way that we need, there's just no question that it can only be done with a Democratic legislature. So I would definitely see my role as a lawmaker to be very actively engaged in raising money, volunteers, support, everything that is needed to help Democrats take back the legislature, because we just aren't going to have the kind of results we need unless that happens. The same thing with the governor's mansion. So my job won't start after I win the general election. My job will start as soon as I win the primary and can shift my focus to helping other progressive Democrats around the state win their general election, because that is going to be the difference maker. That said, in terms of our relationship, we also need to have a strong Democratic governor, so that's also critical. And I also, because of my experience working in the legislature, I do have connections with a lot of lawmakers from other parts of the state, in particular, from the western half of the state. And I think those relationships will come very much in handy as a member of the legislature.
Many of Philadelphia's leaders believe that the gun violence problem could be solved with better gun regulation. Harrisburg has traditionally disagreed with that. What would you do to facilitate a true conversation about this?
So I do agree that we do need additional, regulations of gun control, in particular to keep illegal guns from coming into Philadelphia. But I do not believe fundamentally the solution to Philadelphia's gun violence problem and homicide problem, which is obviously related, is going to happen through the regulations of guns. I think that's a component of it. I don't think it's the only component of it. And I believe that if you look at the neighborhoods where Philadelphia is experiencing the biggest jump in shootings, the biggest jump in homicides, these are neighborhoods with deeply entrenched poverty and deeply concentrated poverty. That has been true for a very long time. That's where the homicides are mostly taking place. That's where shootings are taking place. That's where the uptick is taking place. Until Philadelphia does something to aggressively address our poverty rate of 28%, we're always going to have a gun violence problem. We're always going to have a lot of the other problems that come up with concentrated poverty. And the only solution to that is to give people the tools that they need to lift themselves out of poverty, including direct payments if necessary. But no, I don't think we get our way out of this problem just through gun safety legislation, which I support. But there's other deeper issues that have to be addressed if we're really going to find our way out of this.
And you perfectly segued to my next question as well. What will you be able to do in Harrisburg to impact Philadelphia's poverty epidemic?
Yeah. Personally, I mean, the thing that I'm most interested in, honestly, are at this point UBI, Universal Basic Income, which are automatic payments to people below the poverty line to lift them out of poverty. This is a controversial idea, especially on the left, because it doesn't really transform the economic system. It just gives people, sort of a baseline to survive. But I am, some people are critical of it because Andrew Yang made a big thing out of it and people don't like him. But for me, it's like we have people who are suffering right now. We are dealing with the consequences of entrenched poverty right now. And if we don't do aggressive things right now as quickly as possible to give people the help that they need, we're going to continue to have, the ramifications of deeply entrenched poverty and concentrated poverty in certain neighborhoods. So I like UBI. I think we need to make sure that people have affordable and free health insurance so they're not bankrupted by medical bills. People need access to job training, to reliable public transportation, affordable transportation options so they can get to and from work. I mean, there are so many things that we have to do. But I think the most immediate thing that we can do, honestly, is UBI to just lift people out of poverty immediately. That obviously is going to cost money. But, the state budget is billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars. Don't let anybody ever tell you that there's not enough money in Pennsylvania to address these issues. There are. We just choose to spend money in other places.
What else should people know about you or your campaign?
Well, the first thing I would say is, I'm really proud to be from Center City, to be rooted in this community. I've lived in Center City now for over a decade. Me and my wife have lived in Center City West now for close to 8 or 9 years. I lived in Washington Square West for a number of years, so I'm really familiar. I served on the Civic Association boards for a lot of these neighborhoods, so I really am very, very familiar with the neighborhoods. I'm from here. And I've lived here a long time. I also am really proud to be involved in a lot of different community groups and serve on boards that I think reflect my values. Places like the Civic Association or the Jewish Labor Committee, Friends of Greenfield Elementary, which is a fundraising arm for public schools here in our district. And so I think with that, sort of the bedrock of being from here for a long time, having that deep government experience at pretty high level jobs, and having the values of our neighborhood and to bring that to Harrisburg, I think that's what makes me the right fit for the district. And I hope folks will give me the opportunity to serve.
Where can people learn more about your campaign?
People can go to votewaxman.com, which is our website. You can find more information than you ever wanted to know about me, my position on the issues, how to get involved with the campaign, how to contribute if you want to make a donation. All of that is at votewaxman.com.
All right, Ben Waxman, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it, and have a great day.
You too. All right, we would like to thank Ben Waxman for joining us. You are listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website, www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHWWPPM. Now, Lance, tell us a little bit about the Septa budget and what's going on there.
Well, before we do, I want to make a full disclosure. I didn't participate in the Ben Waxman interview, even though I live in the district, because I've known Ben for more than 20 years, and I've given to his causes and his candidacy, and I didn't think it was appropriate for me to interview him. But I did want to disclose to any of our viewers or listeners that I have given to his campaign in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not going to comment any further. Septa, like the city, has an annual operating budget and an annual capital budget. Unlike the city, most of the proceedings happen very quietly without anyone knowing. Septa's annual budget is a great document to look at. Many wonderful pictures, lots of diagrams, pie charts I don't even know what you would call them, but very colorful. And every year on the front cover, they like to say who gave them an award for the best budget this year. I didn't realize that was a competitive sport, but apparently, much like the bus rodeos, which are competitive sports, the best public transit budget is very competitive, and people in Philadelphia should be happy to know that Septa almost always wins. So I'm going to go through not the capital budget, and there's some reasons for that. Maybe if we have time later in the month, we'll go over the capital budget. The public hearings are coming up in May. But the capital budget relies upon other funding, and it's not so clear to me how much in the capital budget is real and how much of it is hopeful and how much of it is never going to happen. The operating budget happens, so that's what we're going to focus on. And I'm going to try and go to my slideshow, and maybe there we go. So there is some good news, and that is this year, there's not proposed any fare increase. In fact, there's a few lines where there's going to be a modest rate reduction, and that's going to be in the transit, the 3-day pass, and the 1-day convenient pass. But I think it's worth looking at this for a second because this kind of points to an issue that I want to raise later on that isn't addressed in the annual operating budget. And that is, if you look, the cost of a cash ride is $2.50. The cost of a key ride using your key card is $2. That's a 50-cent difference. But the real difference is in the transfer. If you look at it, it says Septa says the key card transfer, the first one is free, and the second transfer is $1. Well, if you don't have a key card, for whatever reason, we're going to discuss that later, you can't buy a transfer for $1 and you can't get a free transfer. So on average, what we're looking at is a tremendous penalty for not being able to have a key card. And while it's good news that there's no fare increase this year, what we're really going to be looking at is going to be next year for a major fare increase. And Septa says that they like to have fare increases every 3 years. Now, again, because we're talking about Septa, it's a little tricky because they haven't had one in 3 years. You could argue that because of COVID, that's been off schedule. But what they're saying is every 3 years, they want to try and raise fares. And while there's some argument that you have to keep up with inflation, raising fares and how you raise fares becomes a very important issue in terms of economic justice. So what we have to look at really is who is Septa, who benefits from Septa, and who rides Septa. Now, many people think when we talk about Septa, the only people who benefit are the riders. But that's not true at all. I mean, obviously, the riders get a tremendous benefit from Septa. We get to go where we want, to visit, to go to parks, to go to see games. One of the best ways to see the Phillies, for those of us who are sports fans, is to ride the Broad Street line rather than pay for parking. It's just a wonderful way to get to the stadiums or the concerts. It doesn't really matter what team you're rooting for, but it's a way of keeping the costs down. When we talk about football, the Eagles, that's an important part, but it's a wonderful way. So the riders get the benefit. Commuters obviously get the benefit. We get to go to work. But what we don't recognize often is employers get the benefit. So if you own a Rite Aid or a franchise and you're paying $8 or $9 an hour, it's almost impossible for your workers to get to work unless they can ride Septa. So the employers need Septa. Retailers, Macy's in Center City. And again, it's an unusual time because of COVID. But if there's going to be something at the old, with a building that used to be known as the Gallery, the Fashion District, if any of those are going to make it, it's going to be in part because Septa can take shoppers there. So retailers make it. Doctors and hospitals, again, whether they use paratransit, a way for people who are disabled to get to work, to get to the doctor's office, or get to the hospitals, or they take regular Septa. To get to a downtown hospital, downtown doctor's office, Septa gets you there. Septa is also our school bus system for our older kids. Now, our school system is built around some local schools, some magnet schools, and some charter schools. Whatever you think of magnet schools and charter schools, and that's a longer conversation, none of them could exist without Septa being there to take our students from home to school. Central, Girls High, Bodine, Kappa, all of these magnet public schools, and I saw Masterman was just listed as the 10th best school in the nation right here in Philadelphia. None of these schools will work without Septa being able to take the students to them. The environment benefits from Septa. One of the best things we can do for the environment is have a vibrant public transit system that takes cars off the road and keeps the air clean. Another part of who benefits from Septa that we often don't think about are drivers. Now, for those people who drive to work during rush hour, I'm just going to ask you to imagine what it would be like if there were 600,000 cars more in front of you on the Schuylkill Expressway, or on the Blue Route, or on 95, or on Roosevelt Boulevard. And most of those cars, because most of the people who ride public transit are economically not that well off, most of those cars aren't going to be new cars. They're going to be old cars that may or may not make it to their job. So if you're a driver, you should be thanking everyone who gets on Septa so you can drive where you want to go. And finally, the region benefits from Septa. The state of Pennsylvania continues to lose population. We're going to lose a congressional seat. But what people overlook is where that loss is coming from. It's not coming from southeastern Pennsylvania. In fact, Philadelphia has had a growth in population, and our southeastern Philadelphia area has actually increased in population enough so that the offset of the rest of the loss isn't so bad. Again, COVID has changed some of this, and we're not going to know exactly what's going to happen for another couple years. But based on historical trends, because we have Septa, because people like to be able to live someplace where there's public transit, where there's access to stores, supermarkets, concerts, Septa helps the region develop. But who are the actual Septa riders? And what we see is Septa, this comes from Septa's annual budget. You see what I mean? These are great charts, absolutely wonderful. And what we see is the majority of riders are non-white, people of color. So 48% are African American, 7% are Hispanic or Latino, 5% are Asians. So when you add all that up, you see that the majority of riders are non-white. And it goes beyond that when you start thinking about poverty and you start thinking about how poor the people are who ride Septa. One of the things that's hard to believe is that 18% of Septa riders live in poverty. Those are households below the poverty level with household income, not one individual income, household income of $15,000 a year or less. 48% of all Septa riders have household incomes of $35,000 or less. And this is why that key card issue becomes so important. Many low-income people, many poor people don't have bank accounts. The Federal Reserve estimates that for low-income people, the majority are actually what are called under or unbanked. They don't have a way to link a key card to their bank account, and they don't have credit cards. So using a key card for the very poor becomes a significant problem. As I spoke about earlier, the key card, the penalty for not being able to afford a key card, and I want to be very clear about this, key cards are great for middle-class people. If you live in Center City or you live near the Broad Street line or the L, and you can get to some place where you can put money on your key card, or you have a bank account, or you have a credit card, and you have some discretionary income, and you can put money on your key card and leave it there, they're very convenient. They're absolutely wonderful, much better than the old token system. But if you don't have an extra $40, if you don't have an extra $20, if you don't live in Center City, you don't have a credit card, using a key card is very difficult. And the penalty is extreme. A key card ride with one transfer is $2. Without the key card, it's $2.50 for the ride and $2.50 for the transfer, a total of $5. $2 for middle-class people, $5 for low-income people. Now, Septa likes to make likes to say how their fares are equity-based fare policy. But as I just went through, for people who don't have key cards, there's no equity here, just the opposite. And there's nothing in the report, in the annual budget proposal, anywhere that talks about who's paying cash and who is using the key cards and how well the key cards are used by low-income people. And in fact, the only thing we really know about the key card is that they've really never performed very well. Now, the key card was late getting here. Most other transit systems had something like the key card before Philadelphia, before Septa started using it. It's not just that we were late getting it. It's not just that it's really troubling. It's that their cost overruns are so extreme, it's actually shocking when you start thinking about it. The cost of the project was estimated at $122 million. It's now up to $238 million, and it's still not working. In the Septa operating budget, they're now setting aside money to pay for Key Card 2.0. Now, they haven't put out the bids yet. They're announcing they're going to be putting out the bids. So we really don't know how much more it's going to cost, and we really don't know what they're talking about. There's some discussion that they're going to use cell phone technology. They're going to use the newest phones to allow people to pay. But again, that becomes very problematic when you realize that if you're making $15,000 a year, it's probably unlikely you're going to have the newest cell phone to be able to use the newest technologies. And we have to be very much aware that Septa serves as a function of helping low-income people travel. It's not that they're making a decision, should I buy a car or should I ride Septa? Now that's, for a lot of people, myself included, I choose Septa. It's a much better decision for me. But I'm not forced to make that decision. Other people who are struggling economically are forced to make that decision, and we shouldn't be limiting their ability to get the benefit of the prepaid cards because they can't afford a new cell phone. So one of the questions becomes, well, who is it that's making these decisions, and why is it that they don't understand what it's like for people who are struggling? The Septa Board sounds very fair. It's comprised of 2 members of every county. 2 people from Delaware, Bucks, Montgomery, Chester, and Philadelphia County. The state legislature, the majority leader appoints one, the minority appoints one, state senate majority leader appoints one, Senate minority leader appoints one, and the governor appoints one. Now, I will grant anyone who says that sounds fair, that it does sound fair, until you consider who's riding Septa and who's paying for Septa. So what we see is, I'm sorry, I skipped a slide. Let me try and go back and get it. In Septa's case, 38% of the service area's residents and 71% of the riders live in Philadelphia. Yet Philadelphia only has 13% of the board seats. Now, the city does have a veto right. So they could go ahead and veto a proposal. But that veto can be overridden at the next board meeting. So, and I've been following SEPTA issues for many, many years. It's only been used once, and it was overridden the next time. But again, 71% of the riders are from Philadelphia, and Philadelphia has 13% of the board seats. And when it comes to paying, it's even more amazing that Philadelphia only has 13% of the seats. So to get the state money, to get the state subsidies, there has to be a local match of 15%. And this goes over which counties pay what match for what divisions. For the city transit division, which is basically in Philadelphia, but it is something that people who come from the suburbs use. So if you get on in Upper Darby, on the L in Upper Darby to come to Philadelphia, or you take a train or a bus into Philadelphia and then transfer, you're using the city transit division. The city of Philadelphia pays 99.48% of the local subsidy. That you could argue is fair. I don't think so, but one could argue that. It's when you look at the regional rail line that it becomes shocking that Philadelphia only has 13% of the vote, or it becomes very understandable why that Philadelphia only has 13% of the vote. For the regional rail line, even though most of it's in the suburbs, even though most of the riders don't live in the city of Philadelphia, Philadelphia pays 70% of the local match. Again, Philadelphia is paying almost 100% of the city transit division match and 70% of the regional rail line match. Now, the argument for the regional rail line is that's to make up for the wage tax, the non-resident wage tax that people pay. And it's an argument. I'm not sure it's right, because workers who come into the city get to use all of the infrastructure in the city. It's like someone who lives here. But in any case, 70% comes from Philadelphia, and Philadelphia has 13% of the board. Just to make the clear picture, and again, this is not my graphics. These come from SEPTA's own proposed operating budget. The blue is the city of Philadelphia. Totally, 82% of the local subsidy is paid by Philadelphia. The rest, small amounts, come from counties. And again, when you start talking about poverty, of all the counties in our region, Philadelphia is the poorest of the counties. Now, one of the things that happens when you don't have control of the board is you don't get to make decisions about how the subsidies, which come from the state and the federal government, are divided. And it becomes somewhat interesting to me to look at these subsidies. The city transit division, for every dollar in fares, gets $3.69 in subsidies. Now, I know there are people out there who say, well, why should they get any subsidy? Well, if you drive to work, you get a tremendous subsidy in terms of you don't pay for the road, you don't pay for the police, you don't pay for the infrastructure, the bridges, all of that. And again, that can be a separate conversation. To any driver who's upset that SEPTA is subsidized, I just want to again remind you, if you close down SEPTA, that's 600,000 more cars ahead of you on the road, and that's the air that you and your children can't breathe that you're creating. But the subsidy, $1 to $3.69. For the regional rail line, the subsidy is $1 for the fare and $4.33 subsidy, much higher than what the city gets. For the Victory Division, which is out in the suburbs, Chester, Delaware, Montgomery counties, the ratio is $1 in fares to $4.44. And the Frontier Division, which is in Bucks County, where the chairman of the Septa Board lives and who he represents, for every dollar in the fare box, Septa gives them $6.39. So this is one of the things that could be changed. There's no law that says this is how the subsidies have to be allocated. And there may be arguments for doing it this way. But obviously, if you only have 13% of the vote and Chester, Delaware, Montgomery, and Bucks County control the board, they're going to control how those subsidies are allocated. Now, there is, again, good news. Septa does a tremendous job in taking all of its money and buying locally. And this map shows you how much money over the last 12 years that Septa has spent in the state of Pennsylvania. And I was hoping that some of the people who were listening to us a few weeks ago talk about Philadelphia buying local would look at this and realize this is doable. It's not that this is pie in the sky argument that the city should buy locally. Septa buys locally. Obviously, the city of Philadelphia can buy locally. It is a little interesting if you look at the western part of the state, where the former Speaker of the State House was, how much money was spent in his county. Again, we could argue about that. That may be a very wise decision on Septa's part. And the only reason I'm calling attention to it is because it's an interesting fact that Septa not only spends locally, but spends politically where the power is. COVID has been incredibly hard on Septa. Even today, Septa's ridership is down by 53%. And when you look at the money in terms of the revenue, it's unbelievable how bad it has been. The actual money for fiscal year 2021 was $149 million, $100 million less than what's normal. And this money, of course, has to come from somewhere. And it really would make it almost impossible for Septa to continue to operate if it hadn't been for federal subsidies to help. And because of federal subsidies, Septa now has enough money to be able to make its budget and go forward. But much like the city of Philadelphia, Septa isn't using the COVID dollars to improve the system, to bring new riders on. They're just using it to plug the hole. And I want to read this because this becomes part of the discussion for people who want to testify at the Septa budget. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, there were no major revenue sources that the authority believed to be unpredictable in nature. The authority has adopted a policy whereby it does not rely on unpredictable revenues to finance ongoing operations. Because the recovery from the pandemic and its impact on operating revenue in fiscal year 2022 remains uncertain at this time, the federal relief funding will continue to help fulfill budget revenue shortfalls experienced next year. So again, much like the city of Philadelphia, it's a conscious decision not to do anything new, not to try and improve the system or improve the city, but just to fill in the holes that have been created because of COVID. Now that, again, you could argue that makes sense, except that one of the things that's happening is people aren't coming back to Septa because they don't feel safe. Tom Fitzgerald, the great reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, has been writing about all of the problems that Septa is facing. And there's no question that people are choosing not to use Septa in some part because they don't feel safe. Now, the Septa Board has taken some steps. They've spent $6.1 million to hire unarmed outreach specialists. Now, they're contracting with a security company, which is really questionable why they think those are the best outreach people, but they're doing something. They're training them. They're going to ride the L and the Broad Street line, patrol stations, and they're going to be 88 specialists. Question is that enough? And what's happening with the Septa budget going forward to address these issues? And unfortunately, the answer is not much. What Septa says in this document, the annual operating budget, is it's going to continue and enhance safety initiatives for employees and passengers. And that's it. No acknowledgement of the problem, no acknowledgement that we have to do something. that very limited amount. Now, you might think, well, that's because the Septa police are going to do something different. And again, the transit police, this is the only statement. Transit police are tasked with preventing and investigating crime and establishing an atmosphere of safety and security. So what is SEPTA doing to address crime? Just what the board did. The problem is, this is a conscious decision on SEPTA's part. It's not that they lack money. Actually, SEPTA has as much money as it has ever had because of the COVID dollars. So they are sitting on a tremendous amount of money, so much money that they won't tell us how much money. It's called the Service Stabilization Fund. And this is money they've set aside. They've put it in a bank, maybe in a mattress, maybe in a jar someplace. We don't know how much, and we don't know where it is, but we know they're not going to spend it unless people demand it on making the riders safe and increasing ridership. So if you could spend $10 million now to increase ridership, and that ridership would be more than $10 million, it wouldn't be spending money, it would be investing money. And again, we don't really know how much money is in the stabilization fund, but they're holding it out and not wanting to spend it until the years 2025, 26, and 27. Again, you might want to argue if everything was fine, that makes sense, but everything isn't fine. Ridership is way down, and we really need to do something to increase ridership because increasing ridership increases revenues. Now, here's the only record I could find in the annual operating budget that talks about how many dollars are in the Service Stabilization Fund. And it's really very difficult to figure out what they're saying because they're using asterisks to tell us what the money is for the service stabilization. I don't know if people can see my cursor, but right down here under the bottom under notes, it shows you which line items are service stabilization funds. I'm not sure I'm right. This is a document that's very hard to decipher because the way the hearings work, we will get a chance to ask questions, but we may not get an answer. But it looks to me to be about $125 million is being put away in a bank account. I'm not sure I'm right. All I know is it was so much money that when they discussed it in the written narrative of the Service Stabilization Fund, they wouldn't write how much money was in it. Now, for those people who think that SEPTA should be putting some more effort into making the system work, or they have ideas about how SEPTA could better spend its money, or they simply want to demand that SEPTA comes up with some sort of app for the phone that will tell them when the bus is coming, when the bus will be here, and where the bus will be, they should come to the hearings. The hearing is May 16th at 10 and 4 p.m. And May 18th at 11 to 6 p.m. Now, SEPTA is going to do this virtually, so you don't have to come downtown. If you are concerned about your ride on SEPTA, if you think that SEPTA ought to do more to make it comfortable, to make it safe, to make it usable, if you would like to voice your concern over SEPTA's decision to make the poor pay more, please come to the hearing. I won't see you there because obviously it'll be virtual, but I will see you virtually there. And hopefully people who are interested will use our report to make a difference.
All right, well, Lance, thank you so much. Two things really stand out. Well, a lot of things stood out, but two things in particular. The ratio of board members to the size of Philadelphia is unbelievable to me. I didn't realize it was that problematic.
It's a concern, and the city could actually say something about it and has chosen not to all these years.
Yeah, it's trouble. And then the other thing is when we talk about people not feeling safe, and I can't remember the gentleman's name. We had the head of the Transit Police FOP on with us probably a couple of months ago, and he said that the general feeling is these extra people, these unarmed guards, I guess, that SEPTA's hiring, that's not going to help anything. And why aren't they trying to get more SEPTA police for this? And the SEPTA police only work on the Broad Street line and the Market Street line. That's it. They're nowhere else. It's very problematic.
And again, the bigger problem is it's not even in the discussion.
Yeah.
People can come down on other sides. The idea of using social workers as opposed to police may be a good one. The problems may be through mental illness, maybe through drug addiction. There may be a tremendous number of reasons why people feel unsafe. But the one thing we know for sure is ignoring it will not work. Putting it under the rug will not work. And having money to put away for when it's needed doesn't make any sense if the money is needed now.
Right.
So I was very thankful to hear the captain talk about the Septa police. We need to do whatever we can for the good of the environment, for the good of our downtown, for the good of the drivers, to do what we can to get people back on Septa. Again, any day that we can get someone out of their car and on Septa makes it an easier day to breathe, makes it an easier day for development, makes it an easier day for tax dollars in the city of Philadelphia. That should be our goal. Making believe that everything is fine when it's not is always a mistake. And I see that we have Denise getting ready to join us, and I think we're getting ready to talk now about some of these issues as they talk about the state of Philadelphia. I'm glad you're watching us on Comcast Channel 66 or listening to us on People Powered Radio. And Denise, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Lance and Larry.
Yeah,
as you can tell, I'm a tad under the weather, but it's ironic that you were talking about Septa and how much the suburbs basically get the services for free at the expense of Philadelphians, because this has been a discussion that has been going on for a while. In fact, when I was working at the Courier-Times in Bucks County, the president of the Septa Board was a guy from Bucks County, and he kind of let folks in the city know that he didn't care about how inconvenienced they might have felt by paying this additional money when they were going to get more service into the suburbs. And the thing is, that's nice that you get more service into the suburbs, but if we're giving you more if you're getting more service, you should also have to pay for it.
Makes sense to me. Pat Dion, by the way, is still the board president.
Yes. Okay. That's kind of what I thought, but he kind of let people know that we're the suburbs, we're in charge, and the fact that this actually makes no sense is just something you're going to have to deal with. And at some point, the city has got to address it, because Philadelphia cannot afford to pay 70% of the regional rail costs. And they really can't afford to pay 99% of the bus and transit costs.
Right. And I think we're going to hear now, as we transition to the state of Philadelphia, why the city can't afford it anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah, and this is really interesting. So Pew put out a report last week, an annual State of the City report, and Larry Eichel, who's been on our program before a couple of times, prepared this report. I'd like to have him on maybe at some point to discuss it, but I wanted us to talk about it first because I wanted to see what we thought and what we were seeing in our reporting and how it sort of relates to this. So the report, I like things like this because it puts a lot of information in one place, a lot of things that we care about and find interesting. And, this focuses a lot on the pandemic, and justifiably so, because that's been the dominating factor in where we are economically and where we are as a whole right now. And it starts off with this sobering note. As of April 2022, Philadelphia recorded more than 300,000 COVID-19 cases and 5,000 deaths since the virus was first detected in Philadelphia. So that right away gives you an indication of how severe the virus hit our city. And actually, based on some of the numbers you see from other places, we actually did better than other places, but it's still terrible. However, according to the report, the city's economy is showing some positive signs. The unemployment rate dropped to 5.8% by December of 2021, which is right where it was before the pandemic. So it went up, and it's sort of leveling off where we were before that. The city's population had been steadily increasing since 2007 and reached 1.6 million in 2020, which is a 5% increase since the 2020 census. So you're seeing a little bit of a climb there in terms of the population. And again, that number I always feel like is soft because I don't think everybody was recorded in the census. I'm never sure about that. But that's the number we're going with. And then, we get into the other issues, right? So we know that the pandemic sort of heightened our awareness and exacerbated the existing problems we already have, including unemployment, crime, and particularly the homicides, what we've been talking about ad nauseum for a couple of years now, about how significant these numbers are. Also, some problems that are be coming down the pike. 15% of commuters, it looks like, are not going to ever return to working in the city. People who previously did, who can work from home, and are just going to stay home, which is going to create a major dent in city revenues. And we don't even know the full effect of that yet. And we don't know the effect of what that's going to look like probably for a couple of years. So this report kind of lays out some of the major issues that we've been seeing across the city, and explains, the demographic changes and the challenges that we have to sort of overcome here. And there's a couple of things I just want to point out. A couple of things that really stuck out to me. There's one section here that talks about the unintentional drug overdose deaths in Philadelphia. And in 2011, 10 years ago, there were 489 unintentional drug overdose deaths. Last year, there were almost 3 times that many, 1,250. I don't think it's a huge surprise that we're dealing with this, but when you look at those numbers and the rate of increase, it's horrifying. Absolutely horrifying. Philadelphia has the second highest drug overdose death per 100,000 residents over the last 2 years, with Baltimore being the only city that surpasses us. We have 72.1 drug overdose per 100,000 people. Baltimore actually doubles that. They're at 144, which is also terrible.
Nuts.
Right. And that has a lot to do with what we're seeing in Kensington, but also, throughout the city. It's troubling. What was the other number I wanted to pull out here? This one is also a big problem, and I think is one of the drivers for a lot of the issues we're seeing right now. The unemployment rate in Philadelphia compared to other comparable cities. The only city in the country, the only big city, that has a higher unemployment rate than Philadelphia is Detroit. Detroit comes in at 9.8%. Philadelphia is 8.9%. Chicago, Baltimore, Cleveland, Washington, Houston, Pittsburgh, Boston, and Phoenix are the other cities in that cohort. It's, and this is something Alan Dom said the other day in a council hearing, and it's not polite or correct to criticize Detroit, but when you're compared to Detroit from an economic standpoint, it's not really a good thing.
Well, I met someone at a journalist convention who was talking to me about Detroit and Philadelphia in terms of their placement in the poorest cities of their size in America competition. And I put that in quotes. And what she told me, because she was an activist from Detroit, what she told me was the only reason why Philly was ahead of Detroit in that way was because Detroit had knocked down so much housing, to where there weren't people living there anymore. They had knocked down so much old housing. And the thing is, that's not something to strive for.
Right.
It's really not. And what, the city has to actually think about is what to do to increase, the amount of money, that, comes into the city, and get some programs together that can actually help people out of, the mess. Because if we're waiting for Harrisburg to pass a minimum wage that's, fair and equal, that ain't happening. They're too busy trying to um, put term limits on Larry Krasner.
Yeah.
That's all they're caring about in Philadelphia right now, putting term limits on Larry Krasner. So
I agree. I think that's one of the things that we should continue to ask the Pew about. It's like, we really don't need to know that we have trouble. I think every one of us in the city knows. What we really need to think about is what do we do to build a middle class population where all people of color, all people are now living a middle class life, which means a good place to live with at least 2 bedrooms, one for the parents and one for the kids, even if it's not ideal with 1 bedroom for each child, but at least 2 bedrooms where everyone gets to go out every now and then, even if it's not to a fancy restaurant, some movie, a bowling alley, and everyone gets at least 2 weeks of vacation a year. How do we start discussing those things in a way that makes sense and the Pew can help us with, as opposed to simply telling us how many of us are living in poverty, how many of us are dying from drug overdose, and what the problems are. Every day around us, all the time, we are given that information. But for all the resources that the Pew has, and for all the money that the Pew has, it's really time for us to ask them, what has worked in other cities? What would work here? And will you, as a foundation, put your money behind those projects? Will you make program investments? Will you, Pew, take, $500 million away from the oil stocks and put it into low-income housing? Will you take some of the money that you've invested in Twitter or in some other stock and put it into small businesses? Foundations, it's great for them to tell us what the problems are, but what really would help is if they took their resources and used them to help us escape poverty.
That's right. That's right. And what I'd like to do really quick, we only have a few minutes left. I want to get to a little bit about the budget. We had some interesting hearings this week, and I'll give my general caveat to what happens here. The hearings went for about 8 hours yesterday, about 7 hours today. So I haven't had a lot of time to go through all my notes and get everything nice and neat. So, but I do have a little bit of a slideshow here, and I want to run through a couple of things with you. And my first page is blank. There we go. So police department testified yesterday. That was the longest hearing. It was about 4 hours. Their budget is increasing this year from $729 million to $782 million. That will easily exceed $800 million plus once we get midway through the budget year, if not before that, when they have to do a mid-year budget transfer for things like overtime and things like that. District Attorney's Office came in yesterday. I just wanted to point out a couple of things here. The District Attorney's Office employs about 600 people, 300 of which are attorneys who act as assistant district attorneys, and they handle 40,000 cases per year, which is about 133 cases per assistant district attorney.
So the question becomes, why are they losing money?
And what's going to happen there, I think, once the courts get fully up to speed again, you're going to have issues where they're going to have to get caught up on all the cases that they didn't have and weren't working during the pandemic. And I think there's going to be a rush. And I think that could be very problematic. And it's something that was discussed a little bit in their testimony yesterday. Public Defender's Office, we're going to have some numbers for them. We don't have them right here, but they basically provide legal representation to those who can't hire their own attorneys. And there's a process for that I'd like to have them come on at some point and walk us through that. I think they would do that. The first judicial district are all the city courts, Court of Common Pleas, Municipal Court. They did not testify yesterday. Things ran a little long. They'll come back at another point. Their budget looks like it's being increased by about $4 million. The law department, they also did not testify yesterday, but they do a lot of different things. It's pretty interesting. They represent the city in all litigation. They help with city contracts. They collect unpaid taxes and fines, and they work with city council to prepare legislation. They advise the city. Their budget is going up by about $2.5 million. The sheriff's office, their budget's going up by about $2 million or so. And basically, the sheriff's office, they provide security for all the courts in the city. They handle foreclosures and sales, which is a hot button issue, and they handle protection orders throughout the city. The Register of Wills, and this is one I'll stop on for a second. Their budget looks like it's going down a little bit. So they do things like marriage licenses. They do probate. They issue letters of administration when somebody passes away without a will. A lot of technical things dealing with wills. There's actually a lot going on. Somebody who's been an executor for a couple of estates, it's very complicated. They're also helping to deal with tangled titles, which is very important. It's when a house has been passed down, but there isn't a clear line of succession in terms of or paperwork for being passed from one person to another, usually a parent to a child, sometimes to another child. This could go on for 4 generations, and it can create a lot of issues. Sometimes people get their houses stolen because of these things. There's all kinds of issues. Today, in City Council, Councilmember Isaiah Thomas asked the Register of Wills about the Tangled Title Program, and what had came out was there was only last year in a pilot program about 14 or 15 tangled titles that were solved. And Councilmember Thomas said, well, is that a lot? Is that not? How does this work? And it turned out that the Register of Wills did not take kindly to that. There was some unpleasantness, I guess is the polite way to put it.
Well, you could simply say, some F-bombs were dropped.
Yeah. And in my experience, and I don't go back all that far, but this was probably the most significant heated moment I have seen in City Council. And after a few minutes, the Register of Wills came back, and everything kind of went normally after that. But it was a kind of an interesting moment. So we're going to have more about this in our newsletter. That's going to be coming out on Saturday, as it always does. We're going to have some more information about the budget hearings and what happened and what's coming up next week. So we'd like to thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you on Hall Monitor next week.
Well, we have a few seconds. We have a few seconds left. One of the things that I hope that when Larry Eichel comes on, I want to ask him about the experience of corporations that left cities in the 1960s and 70s. How many of them flourished versus the companies that stayed in the city? I'm not persuaded that the people who are saying they're not going to come back to work in offices, that those businesses are going to do as well as people who come back and share ideas and share discussions. And now I see we're out of time. So hopefully we'll have that discussion later with Larry.